Functions are a key feature of programming, not just of JavaScript. And functions are basically our own commands which we can define as a developer to then execute them anywhere in our code. And now it's time for our own custom function here. For this, anywhere in your code, you can add a new function by typing the function keyword. So we saw the let keyword for defining variables. Now we have the function keyword for defining functions. Why is it let and not variable? Well, it is what it is. So here we have the function keyword. And as I said, with that, we can create our own command. Hence, the next step is to give our own command a name. And that name is totally up to you. It just, again, has to follow certain rules and conventions. And these rules and conventions are the same as for variable names. However, there is an additional convention that function names should not describe what's in them, but instead what this operation does, since a function is a command that you can later reuse to perform a certain operation. Hence, function names should describe this operation. So here, I want to calculate my adult years, and hence I'll name this function calculate adult years. Now, this naming might still be a bit strange if you have never worked in programming before, but it is something you will get used to. Now, that's the name of our own function, our own command. Now things change a bit though. We don't use the equal sign as we did it for variables. Instead, for functions, we now add opening and closing parentheses, and then curly braces. Opening and closing curly braces. And now between those curly braces, we put our operation code. So the code that makes up this operation. And we can also put something between those parentheses here, but I'll come back to that later. Now, typically, you do now add a new line. So you add a line break and you indent this here a little bit for readability's sake. You don't have to. You can write it all in one line. You also don't have to indent, but it's the common notation to use multiple lines and to indent because that will make it more readable. And in here, you can now perform the operation which you want to outsource. In my case, that's this calculation where I deduct 18 from age. Now, for this, we can copy this code and add it in this function. And now we need to do something with it here. Because like this, we perform this operation, but out of the box, this just produces a new value, which at the moment would go into the void. Now, one thing we could do here is we could store this in adult years. However, not by using let here, but without let, and actually define this adult years variable before we define this function. Maybe like this, without an initial value, which is also allowed. And then here, down there, I just assign a new value and hence I remove let. Now I'll come back to why I'm doing this in a second. But for the moment, let's change our code like this. Now this function, this custom command, overwrites, sets a new value to adult years, and the new value is age minus 18. So what I'm also doing down there. Now, the interesting thing about functions is that actually by defining such a function here, as we're doing it here between lines 12 and 14, does not execute the code in that function yet. When this entire JavaScript code file is being parsed and executed by the browser, once the browser reaches this line and this entire code block, therefore, it will just memorize this function. It will learn your own custom command, so to say, but it will not execute it yet. Instead, you as a developer now have to tell the browser when this function should be executed. And we could do this here instead of performing that operation of which I wanted to get rid of, as mentioned. And to execute a function, you repeat its name, so calculate adult years in my case, and then you add parentheses, opening and closing thereafter. And that's some syntax which might look familiar to you because that's what we're basically doing for the alert, for this built-in command, which turns out to be a built-in function provided to you automatically by JavaScript and the browser. Here we also have a variable between those opening and closing parentheses, but I'll come back to why we have that here and not here later. For the moment here, for calculate adult years, we don't need it. And now we can also calculate adult years here instead of that operation which we had before. And now the advantage of this is that we only have this operation once in our function, and here I should also add a semicolon, and then we just call this function in the different places where we want to perform this operation. And hence, if we ever, for whatever reason, need to change the logic in this operation here, we can do it in this function instead of searching for all the different places in our code where we used this operation. Here, of course, I want to stick to the deduction though. And with all of that, if we save this and reload, we still see 14 and 27 as we did it before. But now we're utilizing our own function, our own command for writing that code once and then using it multiple times in different parts of our code. And that's the key benefit of functions. I also like to call them code on demand. We can define code which is not executed immediately, but which we instead trigger in different parts of our code when we need that code to run.